be conserved in the future, in the present. And what that actually does is age you, right? So that's an imagine a chronically elevated stress response in response to additional uncertainty.
That's right. And one of the main goals of the brain always is to reduce energy expenditure.
Of course.
Just on the immediate time scale, yeah.
Of course.
Yep.
Of course. So that's the other thing that happens too, is that, and this is, I think, the other side of the emotional landscape. So a specified and constrained aim reduces entropy. I think that's the crucial issue. But it also sets up the framework within which hope is possible. Because to the degree that hope is dopaminergically mediated, right, it's a consequence. See, Friston actually had a unified theory. He told me about this when I interviewed him, because I had worked out the anxiety entropy theory with my lab in a separate paper. Okay. But he said something that I didn't know at all. Dopaminergic pleasure is also an entropy reduction phenomenon. And this is why it's so cool. So imagine that you have your aim, your goal, and now you can compute the energy required to get there. Okay, now that the farther you away from their goal, the more uncertainty there is in the pursuit. Now, if you take one step toward your goal and you do that successfully, you get a mark of positive emotion from that. That's a dopaminergic kick, but that does indicate an entropy reduction.
Yes.
So both positive and negative emotion regulation are associated with entropy reduction.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, that's a key thing to know when you're thinking, why are people so glued to their worldviews? It's like, well, because their positive emotion is dependent on and the regulation of their negative emotion. It's like, oh, okay.
And it's a positive feedback loop, because once you have your point of view on something, then of course we know about confirmation bias and other ways where you seek data that merely validates and you ignore the data that speaks against it.
You can see that, given what we talked about with regard to perception, you can see why that's the case. Once I specify an aim, what I'm going to see are things that move me towards the aim.
Exactly.
That means the contradictory information not only is irrelevant, should be irrelevant. Like, if I'm trying to walk across the room, I shouldn't be attending to every potential obstacle that could conceivably exist.
Yeah.
Right? I've already simplified things. So the obstacles aren't even there.
Right, exactly. By the way, which makes me want to come back to a point that you mentioned about socially seeing people as friends or foes. In fact, the way we see most people in the world are strangers. Yeah. We don't need to worry about.
Yeah, exactly. Irrelevant.
Most things are irrelevant. Exactly. Most things are irrelevant.
Yeah, yeah. And thank God for that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's analogous here.
Hallucinogens seem to blow that into pieces, by the way. That's what they do. Is they
cause you to pay attention. Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. You pay attention. Everything becomes relevant. So
exactly
that's the awe-inspiring element of the experience. But it's also very, very, very high entropy.
Yeah.
Right.
And you know what I was going to say? That this also ties back to another thing about maturation. Maturation, as who is it? I think it was Fitzgerald who said, is the ability to hold two contradictory ideas in mind at the same time. So what we're trying to do always is get our aim to reduce the entropy, our worldview. But, as we mature, we say, okay, look, it could be this. On the other hand, it could be that. And the ability to hold that and not have that, to have a slightly higher entropy and not have that be stressful to us. I don't know that I have a general model.
That's not a bad definition of a kind of a true confidence, right?
Yeah.
Right. It's also it is the model of sophisticated thinking, because one of the things you do when you think is voluntarily enter into a higher entropy state. Because to really think something through is to allow internal conflict to manifest itself. The different ideas you have are different manifestations of different aims.
Yeah.
And so when you think, this is what we're trying to train people in university. It's like, be resilient in the face of voluntarily confronted entropy, at least on the cognitive side.
That's great. And maybe instead of think, we could call it something like reconsider, because it's, there's this, I only say this because thinking is sort of a term that might have too much semantic weight on it.
Yeah.
But reconsider, meaning, okay, I've already considered this. I know exactly how to think about it, low entropy, but now I'm going to reconsider this. I'm going to think about, what if I'm wrong about this? What if it's a totally other model? Yeah.
Well, so there's also evidence, this is very cool too. There's evidence that if you do that involuntarily, the entropy state is higher than if you do it voluntarily. And the evidence is very profound. It's very profound. And so if you take a stance of voluntary confrontation with conflict, the stress consequence is much minimized over when it happens voluntarily. That's partly why exposure works in behavior therapy. So if you have someone who's traumatized and they're involuntarily exposed to a trigger, they get worse. But if they voluntarily expose themselves, they get better, right? Even though the stimulus, so to speak, is the same.
Interesting.
And I think it has something to do with a high order meta narrative. Like the highest order meta narrative should be something like, I can contend successfully with entropy. It's certainly with chaos. That's the sort of creature that I want to be, that I should be.
Yeah.
Right. Because then when it comes up, you don't
have
dissolve.
a reaction to it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. And I imagine this comes up a lot because people are involuntarily confronted with their, let's say, their political views. Often there's a whole social component to that, which is I'm getting challenged by this person, maybe in front of other people, that sort of thing.
Definitely.
And so there's all this other stuff that comes into play. But if you get to sit in the peace of your own home and think, what if I'm wrong? What if the other party's point on this bill is...
What would that look like?
What would that look like? Yeah, that's a much calmer situation.
Yeah, well, the social element of that is also an entropy issue as far as I can tell, because imagine that, this took me a long time to parse through. So the higher you are in a hierarchy, social hierarchy, the lower entropy your state. Your connection networks are better, your shelter's better, your security's better. Like, that's all part of being higher in a hierarchy. Okay, now the question is, what gives you the right to that position? And the answer to that is something like your accuracy in view and your competence, right? If it's a functional hierarchy. Okay, so now I come along and challenge you. Okay, so part of that, I'm going to cause internal distress in the manner that we described, but I'm also questioning the validity of your grip on the position in that hierarchy. So imagine a faculty meeting where you make a presentation or a professor makes a presentation and a first-year graduate student stands up and issues a successful challenge. Now, some of that's ideational, and you might say, well, maybe he's got a better theory, but some of it is a challenge to the validity of the fact that you're higher in the hierarchy than he is.
Absolutely.
Right, and that that's played out, right?
Yes, yeah.
Right. So, yeah. So that's also an entropy issue, even the sociological element of it.
Yeah. I'm always interested in these old, the physicists in the early 20th century. Einstein was giving a presentation, and I'm afraid I forgot I think it was Heisenberg who challenged, a young kid challenged him, and Einstein said, I think you're right. And he went home and worked on the problem for 5 days and came back. But I'm just, these stories of that kind of challenge, and Einstein had, a very mature reaction.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think a fair bit of the, what would you say, the fundamental psychological necessity of something like hero mythology is the inculcation of the attitude that you just described as characteristic of Einstein. It's like, here's a challenge. It's like, I can handle that.
Yeah.
I don't have to get defensive. It's not going to throw me off. Maybe there's opportunity. That's the dragon and the treasure, by the way. Maybe there's opportunity here in this challenge. Right? That's a very high order match. It takes very high order maturation to realize that. In every challenge, there's opportunity. Right.
Excellent.
Right. And that's something you can practice. It's an attitude that you can practice.
Yes. Excellent.
Okay, we should stop this.
Okay.
We're going to move to the Daily Wire side.